Hey Indie Warriors, BarelyMagicMike here, and I'm back with another episode of Indie Insights. This is our brand new show where the staff rotates out. A different one of us will be talking each week about some topic in the indie gaming space that we find interesting and want to discuss with you all. So this week my topic is going to be something that I've seen repeated over and over in YouTube comments and Reddit forums and Discord and just about everywhere. And it is the question, why are there so many roguelikes? We all know the indie gaming space is stuffed full of them. There are probably multiple new roguelikes that come out just about every single day. It's an extremely popular genre, but I think I've seen some fatigue from some people, and I've even had some fatigue myself as somebody who played, I think I counted over 30 roguelikes last year, many for review and many just because I find them to be a lot of fun. But not all roguelikes are created equal, and the question of why there are so many of them is very valid because I think there is some logic that can kind of tie that together. But first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. Some of you, or a lot of you, may have probably seen that people like to distinguish between a roguelike and a roguelite. A distinction that I never felt was super duper important, but I'll kind of cover it here really briefly. I think there are a few different takes on this. There's sort of the purist take that a roguelike can only really be a game that is like the 1980 turn-based RPG Rogue, which had permadeath, very high difficulty, randomly generated runs, and turn-based gameplay, as I said, and no meta progression. Every single time you were starting, you started all over with kind of only your skill to guide you through your progression on the game. I think that considering roguelike to be just games that are like Rogue isn't a very useful definition. It's way too specific for a genre, so the more commonly used definition or distinction between roguelike and roguelite that I've seen is that a roguelike is a game that you will progress through randomly generated runs, little to no meta progression, with mostly your skill level being what drives you through the game and to the next area. Whereas roguelite, which is by far the most common nowadays, is a game with randomly generated runs where there is some sort of progression in between. There's something you're progressing toward. You're either getting currency to unlock items that help you in your next run, or unlocking different possibilities like cards in Slay the Spire, for example. But again, that is what we see most often. And for this video, I'm just going to use the word roguelike because it's the most commonly used word, and I don't really see the point in distinguishing between the two kinds when they're two sides of the same coin, so to speak. So I guess the question is not why are there so many roguelikes, but why are there so many bad roguelikes? Not to disparage any indie developers. I know a lot of them are really trying their hardest to put something out into the world that people want to play, and that's a product of their passion. But what's interesting about the roguelike genre in particular is that just because something is a bad roguelike doesn't really make it a bad game. And I think there's no better example of this than a game actually in the AAA space. I know, this is an indie game show, but bear with me here. I'm talking about Returnal. Returnal is sort of an interesting game for this discussion because as far as I know, it's the first kind of modern AAA roguelike that I've seen. I played a bunch of it. I did not finish it because I found it very, very frustrating. Your mileage will obviously vary on that, but what I found the most frustrating about Returnal is that it is a great game. The game feels incredible, the shooting feels incredible, the haptics feel incredible, the world, the visual design, the audio. It's really quite an accomplishment, but for every way that Returnal is an excellent shooter, it's a pretty bad roguelike. There are a few reasons for that. One being that all the runs feel pretty much the same. You don't have a lot of meta progression either between the runs. There's some sort of weapon proficiency leveling up, but it never really felt concrete. I never felt like I was progressing, even though there are technically some minor mechanics that do help you progress. And generally, I was spending so much time on each run, often 2 hours or more, and not really making much progress. There could be rooms where enemies could just kill you instantly, and in an hour and a half, your progress is just completely lost. And then there are obviously items you can find that can sort of buff your run and maybe synergize with one another to help you progress, like in any decent roguelike, but they were pretty hard to find, and you had to generally explore every inch of each biome every time, which looked the same as the last time you explored it, to really have hope of making decent progression. So I was not a fan of Returnal as a roguelike, and I think it would have been much better as either a linear game or some sort of like semi-open world or Metroidvania-like thing, but roguelike didn't feel like the format. And I actually reviewed a game last year that kind of reminded me of Returnal in a way, even though this was a first-person shooter, and I'm talking about Abyssus. Some of you might have seen my review on that one and noted that I didn't really like it very much. Core gameplay is definitely not as strong as Returnal, but it was still pretty good. The game was fun to play, it had really solid first-person shooting, not a whole lot of enemy or environmental variety, but that kind of gets into the issues of it with it as a roguelike. But the main problem with Abyssus is that, and this is kind of what I'm reaching toward in terms of roguelikes in general, Abyssus was a game that simply shouldn't have been a roguelike, which I feel like that with a lot of first-person shooters. I would really like to try a first-person roguelike that I enjoy, but I haven't really found one yet. If y'all have any recommendations for me, please let me know. But I find that the FPS genre is one that is uniquely suited to be very, very repetitive, and what I like about good FPS campaigns is that they kind of mix things up. You might have vehicle sections, you might have different story beats and scripted sequences that are really interesting and have new powers unlock pretty regularly. So I like myself a good FPS campaign, but Abyssus was just an absolute drag. You know, you would get through a run and you might have enough resources for meta progression to unlock a little node on your upgrade tree that says, oh, you can now reload 3% faster. Wow, thank you so much. That is a real game changer. And then the upgrades that you would get mid-run that would last just only for that run, they didn't tend to be very impactful either. It might be, a 20% buff to this specific power, or maybe you have a chain lightning ability now that you shoot one enemy and another enemy gets damaged a little bit. They were really just damage buffs and didn't change the runs materially at all. So, what I'm really getting at here is that not every game needs to be a roguelike, and some of them are, in my opinion, to pad out the playtime. It's not that roguelikes are easy to develop by any means, and especially making a good one is very difficult to develop. It's that I feel like some developers use the roguelike structure as a crutch to add content to their game that otherwise doesn't have much content. And I think Abyssus was a great example of that. There was very little environmental variety going on. Everything looked kind of the same. There weren't all that many different upgrades to keep the game interesting. It felt like if it were a linear shooter campaign, with the amount of content I saw, it probably would have only taken a few hours to get through at most. Whereas as a roguelike, you could play it for dozens and dozens of hours because, why not repeat the same content over and over and over with barely any variation. So I think that's what we're seeing a lot of in the roguelike space. We're seeing games that didn't need to be a roguelike, but they are anyway to kind of pad out the playtime. A couple years ago, I reviewed another one called Days of Doom, and I actually credit this game for kind of turning me off of turn-based tactics games because this game is so notorious in my memory because when I reviewed it, I was frequently having trouble staying awake. It was so boring. It was the most dreadfully basic turn-based tactics zombie game. Every run felt the same. Meta progression was super sluggish. It just felt like it had no reason to exist, and it absolutely felt like it existed as a roguelike to pad out its content. And now, just a few days ago, we had Mugenics release, and after seeing the reviews for that one, I was like, hey, I haven't really tried a turn-based tactics game in a while, other than Menace, but that was not for me either. But I figured Mugenics, let's give it a go. Let's see if this is like a good example of a turn-based tactics roguelike that can get me back into it. And you know what? I've only played a couple of hours, so that's kind of all my impressions are worth of it. But so far, it is excellent. It's easy to get into. Every run has so much variety. None of it feels the same. It's very charming, and you can tell that this is a roguelike that was designed to be a roguelike, because there are so many possibilities, so many different status effects and classes to play as, and items that can change your run, and everything feels impactful. There are no 3% reload mechanics or any of that stuff. My next example, I would say this kind of veers a little more toward the roguelike definition than roguelite, but Slay the Spire. There isn't a ton of meta progression in Slay the Spire, but you unlock a bunch of new cards and they can really change the run up quite a bit. Slay the Spire is, in my opinion, my absolute favorite roguelike, because every run can feel completely different. There are so many different strategies to employ. It never got old, and as somebody who typically bounces from game to game to game pretty quickly, it's pretty rare that I spend more than 10 hours on a single game, honestly. I spent 140 hours with Slay the Spire. I loved it, and absolutely can't wait for the second one. I spent quite a bit of time in Balatro too, which similarly has, it is a relatively simple gameplay loop, but has so many different build varieties and strategies that it constantly stays fresh. And I want to see more games like this, honestly, and we do see them pretty frequently. I gave a lot of examples of sort of deck builders and turn-based tactics stuff, but even Hades 1 and 2 are great roguelikes. Now, did I get a little tired of traversing the same environments over and over? Kind of. But at least Hades 2 has the benefit of having two different sort of paths that you can go on a given run, which I guess kind of is Supergiant Games recognizing the fact that maybe it needed a little bit more variety. So my point is that there are always going to be a ton of roguelikes. They're going to be everywhere, because while no indie game is easy to develop, roguelikes are easier to develop if you're going to do it in a lazy way. If you want to make a game that has theoretically infinite randomly generated content, you can do that. You can take a game with a couple hours of content and make it last dozens and dozens of hours, and technically it has plenty of value, even though you're just doing the same thing over and over again. I think that's why there are so many roguelikes, and while I don't think that's going to change, I don't think it changes the quality of the good ones either. The ones like Mugenics and Slay the Spire and Balatro and Hades and Let's Revolution and so many other examples that I can't even think of off the top of my head right now. I think it is an incredible genre, and we will always be here to help you distinguish the good ones from the bad ones. So that's pretty much my spiel on roguelikes today. If you have any especially great examples of roguelikes that you really liked, or maybe roguelikes that you kind of hated, or maybe games that, like some of the examples I gave, you liked but didn't really like the roguelike structure for one reason or another, let me know in the comments. Would love to hear your thoughts. Have a good one, and I will see you all soon.